What's up, Movement Masters? It's Shawn, Myszka, Movement Mastery, and OptimizeMovement.com coming to you with another movement lesson. Now, most of you know how I feel about the technical model of any given movement pattern and skill. I do not believe that there's one technical model, one technical execution that should be used as an idealized model for every athlete to use as an example. And this is a misconception of optimal movement patterns, which has infiltrated movement circles for far too long, in my opinion. Instead, personally, I strive to help my athletes acquire what I refer to as an authentic movement signature for the technical execution of any given movement skill they must perform. And this authentic movement signature takes full advantage of who they are as a human being, their particular nuances of the task that they must perform, the work that they've done prior to that point, and the athlete's unique compilation of previously attained and acquired movement qualities and skills. And in my mind, the physical constraints working on an individual are unique. So it follows suit then that the movement solutions that are optimal for individuals must follow the same condition. Thus, even though I don't believe there's one movement technical execution and model that works for all, I do believe that there's one technical execution that could be deemed most optimal for that given particular individual that will differ from other individuals attempting to perform the same movement skill under similar environmental and task constraint changes. Just how much it differs and what amount of difference could still be deemed optimal will actually be the topic of our conversation here today in this movement lesson. And that's the idea or the concept of movement bandwidth. Now, just because there's going to be flexibility and creativity that's allowed, personally in my mind, in the technical execution from athlete to athlete, doesn't mean that there's going to be certain, or that there isn't going to be, I should say, certain biomechanical truths that must be adhered to in order to be able to define a technique to be efficient, effective, or most optimal. You know, some movement patterns or some movement mechanics in execution of a particular pattern are just flat out wrong and poor and should not ever be tolerated. Thus, there's always going to be a place and a point where we draw the line on the tipping point of what's no longer acceptable when it comes to the technical execution. So, the movement bandwidth in my mind is that range of specific temporal and spatial kinematic considerations, the biomechanics, that an athlete can operate within during the execution of any movement pattern, and it can still be deemed efficient and potentially optimal for that given athlete. So let me repeat that again. The movement bandwidth is the range of specific temporal and spatial kinematic considerations that the athlete can operate within during the execution of any movement pattern and still be deemed efficient and potentially optimal. Now, there's going to be a few ways to look at the concept of the movement bandwidth. The first two of these will be inter-individual bandwidths, meaning from individual to individual, while the third one we're going to discuss is going to be intra-individual, or acceptable movement variability within the given individual in their particular technical execution of that respective movement pattern and skill. So the first that we're going to discuss here is that the movement bandwidth can include big picture items such as kinematic landmarks in the spatial and temporal organization that the athlete should get into, or that range that they should not exceed. Here I'm talking about things such as the direction of force or the angles of projection, maybe the relative timing of the sequences or the phases in the coordinative structure, these types of things. But for any movement pattern, we can't say with certainty that the athlete must come out of a blocks at exactly 46 degrees when accelerating from a three-point stance or something like that. You know, that's what that athlete should constantly work towards and strive to. Instead, we can and should think about an acceptable range for that displayed characteristic and other global aspects of the kinematic structure or biomechanics. The second that I want to discuss is the movement bandwidth, including details of the local orientation of the kinematic structure. Aspects which will describe specifically the biomechanics, or will define or describe the specific biomechanics used. The knee angle should be this degrees of range of motion during a vertical jump, or the base of support should be this wide during a lateral power cutting action, or something of the like. The steps should be placed in this specific or particular spot when you accelerate. Things like that. Again, there should always be ranges of acceptable movement bandwidths of these displayed characteristics. Not one model that everyone should attempt to imitate and entirely work towards, no matter what the athlete model that we're using has achieved and how he or she elects to complete the task, or what movement patterns emerge when they do perform the task. Finally, we know that no matter who that athlete may be and how masterful they may be, the technical execution of any given movement skill will never be constant, meaning there will always be intra-individual movement variability present. Intra-individual. So within the individual, there will always be movement variability present from rep to rep, execution to execution, practice to practice. In fact, I believe that the more masterful the mover, the greater that variability will be, at least for open and chaotic, non-predetermined movement situation and context. For example, in these cases, the more masterful mover may actually have greater flexibility in his or her ability to carry out a movement solution as the task and the environmental constraints change, whereas a less masterful mover would likely possess a more stereotyped movement signature that is very predictable, it's rigid, they're trying to control a lot of things, but changes pretty drastically with task variability, and doesn't always, the biomechanics doesn't always remain in the athlete's control. So all in all there, the level of movement mastery in skill acquisition will really serve to determine the amount of variability that we could expect in the movement, and then therefore also the range of that movement bandwidth. And hopefully some of that makes some sense to you all. So overall in my mind, the concept of the movement bandwidth will basically say that if you take any number of athletes that reside at a similar level of qualification, and they could potentially achieve the same outputs or similar outputs from their technique or execution of a particular movement pattern and skill, as well as the same performance outcome, but they could have achieved that performance outcome in a different process, in a very distant or distinct kinematic strategy. And in my mind, this is more than acceptable. In fact, it's what I desire. That is, as long as that kinematic structure is within that given movement bandwidth for the respective skill in its patterns and actions. And in my mind, it's our job as movement professionals to strategically manipulate that authentic movement signature in technical execution through our drills and through our instruction, while still staying within these established bandwidths for each type of movement pattern or skill. So hopefully this idea and this concept makes some sense to you. It's something to think about. We're not looking at an idealized movement signature, an idealized movement technique, but instead what we're looking for is an optimal, authentic movement signature, one that operates within given biomechanical movement bandwidths. So for another movement lesson, this has been Shawn Myszka, Movement Mastering, OptimizeMovement.com. Till next time, I'll talk to you guys on the flip side, and until then, let's continue to master the art of optimizing movement.